Yes, Pablo, everyone's been admitted now, and you can start.
Tell me when? 1 minute.
You can start now, yes. Everyone's been admitted now.
Thank you so much. Welcome all to the session, The Internet's Environmental Impact and Action-Oriented Dialogue. My name is Pablo Hinojosa. I work for APNIC, the regional internet registry for Asia Pacific. I'm based in Brisbane, Australia. Here is early afternoon. It is fantastic to see old friends here, but even more fantastic is to see new faces that are interested on this subject. The question about internet's environmental impact is very new in the context of the IGF. For the first time ever in its 14 years, the global IGF will have a full thematic track on environment. 12 workshop proposals were accepted to be included in the program for the IGF 2020 in November. This is also a brand new topic here at the APrIGF, and thankful to the program committee to accept this workshop into the schedule. We have a formidable opportunity here because we can set the tone and share great ideas to influence how the global IGF will discuss the internet's environmental impact. So I would like to invite you before the IGF to think hard on how the internet sector, but more importantly, the internet community can have the most positive impact on the environment. Perhaps we can be as ambitious as to say the internet can help save the planet and can help solve climate change. We just need to figure out how. That's the idea behind this action-oriented dialogue. And I think there are so many governance-related questions that will come up if we take the challenge of promoting a positive internet impact in the environment. So when thinking about this workshop, we thought, with whom do we need to talk to share our internet governance experience? And I am so happy that a fantastic group of people that are directly working in environmental sustainability have accepted to be with us here today at this APrIGF to inspire us about the importance of the environmental cause and to think together about a positive way in which the internet governance community can help them in their jobs. I would like to welcome Kahtryn Sforcina, world known as an internet alchemist, dedicating her career in finding how frontier technologies can make a positive impact on our people and planet. She agreed to facilitate a dialogue that includes three visionaries. First, Andrew Zolli, who is joining us in the middle of his night. It is almost 2 a.m. for him. Thank you so kindly. He's Vice President of Global Impact Initiatives at Planet, a very cool geospatial imaging organization that basically takes daily pictures, daily selfies of every corner of the Earth from a constellation of satellites. We also have David Jensen, who is the coordinator of the Digital Transformation Task Force at the United Nations Environment Programme, UNEP. He has led a wonderful effort of coordinating a concept paper titled The Case for a Digital Ecosystem for the Environment. I hope we can learn more about that digital ecosystem today. And we cannot be more thankful but to welcome Audrey Tang, Taiwan's digital minister. If there is someone that has made true the prospect of data collectives for public good, it is Audrey. And I think there is no one best who can help us think about how the internet can be used for good and solve environmental challenges. Audrey will need to leave us before the end of the meeting. But again, I welcome enormously for your time. The proposal is the following. First, Kahtryn to facilitate a dialogue between Andrew, David, and Audrey. Secondly, for that dialogue to inspire a conversation about actions that we can undertake in the APrIGF to bring forward to the global IGF and importantly, to help with the environment. I want to encourage you to use the chat room actively to share your views, comments, ideas, also information sources and articles about the internet and the environment. I also would like to request if you have questions, please ask them on the chat room as well to guide the discussions. I prefer questions to be asked via the chat room. If you have an important thing to add to the discussion, you are very welcome, and it is if it is relevant and focused, please just raise your hand so we can give you the floor. With that, I give you the floor, Kahtryn, and I hope this will be a very good session for all attending and those receiving us from the web stream and other places.
Thank you, Pablo, and thank you so much for that kind introduction, as well as to APrIGF in extending an invitation to me to facilitate this conversation today. As Pablo has mentioned, we're here to talk about environmental data. Given climate crisis that we're all now facing, having enough environmental data, as well as accurate and timely environmental data, has become an imperative across every sector, industry, and country. As with anything that involves a multitude of stakeholders, this represents both massive challenges and opportunities, all of which must meet at the intersection of governance across every stage of the data value chain in order to be effective. As Pablo mentioned, to dive deeper into this complex issue, we have with us today Audrey, David, and Andrew joining us. Thank you guys for being here. Andrew, we know it's such an ungodly hour for you this morning, so we thought that we would do our best to try and keep you awake. So we're going to get the ball rolling with yourself, if that's okay.
It's my great pleasure. Thank you so much. It's a wonderful. I just want to, before we get started, just applaud the instinct behind this discussion. The community of people who think about ecological stewardship, conservation science, and how we deal with planetary challenges, and the community of people who think about the governance of the internet and the stewardship of the underlying philosophy, the sort of federated philosophy of the internet. They don't speak to each other with enough frequency, and there is enormous value in enriching each other's communities with this discussion. The two philosophies, I think, are very powerful, and this morning, as it's certainly morning for me, about 2 in the morning, I thought I'd just share some brief observations. But in order to do that, because I work in the realm of imagery, I thought we'd maybe show some things. So I'm going to try and switch my screen on. Let's see if I can share my screen. Can you all hold on just one moment? Yep. Okay. And let's try that one more time. Can you all, let's see if you can see my screen. Oops. Is that coming through?
Yeah.
Wonderful.
Yes.
Terrific. Okay, so I'd like to just begin because I come from this hybrid world that's thinking about the problems of environmental data and the environment that we live in, and particularly the kind of twin fundamental crises, really a trio of crises, I should say, the climate crisis, the loss of nature, and the kind of attendant challenges in the human community. I wanted to just give some sort of foundational observations for people who might be new to this conversation, coming from the technology and governance side, but who do not live with these problems every day. It's worth noting that we now have less than a decade to avoid locking in the worst effects of climate change. People in our community, the people who are thinking about these challenges, consider this to be the most essential decade, essentially in the history of our awareness of the problem. That we're living through the most consequential period when decisions we make now will have enormous ripple effects on our ability to take action effectively to conserve the planet, to reduce suffering, to reduce the kinds of impacts that we saw in Australia, as you could see here, as we recently have experienced in California, and as we're increasingly experiencing around the world. So this is a moment when this is an all hands on deck emergency. I think we have to sort of start with that fundamental assumption. The second thing is to understand what the roots of that problem really are. And that problem from an environmental perspective begins with the fact that human beings have now transformed about 75% of the planet, of the land surface of the planet. We've also transformed the oceans in equally profound ways. But if you look at our ecological function on the land, it's largely to do this. It's to terraform the earth. And we've terraformed about 3/4 of it. The reason we've done that is because, let's see if we can, is because primarily for 3 reasons. One is for growing food, both animal, livestock, and agriculture, for cities, and then ultimately for other forms of resource extraction. About 1/3 of the world now actually is dedicated to cultivating crops and livestock. So what we do as a species is we turn this into land that we then cultivate for feeding ourselves. The pressures that we put on that wild habitat that we convert for human use is the source of most of what are called the zoonotic illnesses that come to infect human beings. That are called zoonotic because they jump from animals into humans and back again. We think that the COVID-19 pandemic was a novel coronavirus that began in bats. Bats host thousands of novel coronaviruses. As we stress their habitats, we increase the interactions they have between wildlife and domesticated livestock and then human beings. And the more we do that, the more opportunities we create for the next pandemics to occur. In fact, indeed, it's important to realize that the public health with the way we think about COVID is really as a public health issue with the way we talk about it, but it really fundamentally is an ecological issue. The challenge is these kinds of pressures that we are experiencing, the pressures to cultivate land to feed people, the pressures that we're putting on the landscape to extract energy, the pressures that we're putting on the ecosystem to move goods and services and to make the goods and services, the durable goods that we live with, are all happening before the next billion people, about the next 7th or 8th of the world shows up just in the next decade alone. So we're talking about huge new waves of people. If we do not figure out how to de-intensify the pressures that we put on the planet will ultimately eliminate us, because the forests we cut down really are the lungs of the planet. They're the fundamental systems that allow human life to flourish. Indeed, people who work on these problems every day, this is work from the Stockholm Resilience Center in Stockholm, have identified 9 what are called 9 planetary systems or planetary boundaries. These are the fundamental life-giving systems that drive and make possible life on the Earth. And we are stressing some of these systems well beyond their regenerative capacity to heal as we use them year in and year out. So we're stressing the integrity of the biosphere. We're stressing the flow of chemistry from the Earth's crust into the atmosphere. We're pushing the land change system into a dangerous place. We're moving the climate into a dangerous place. And in some cases, we don't have enough data to measure. But what we know is that as we're piloting this spaceship through the cosmos, we're pushing all the life support systems into a place of duress. So here, let me say to you that at this point, if you were just listening and you didn't know anything else, you'd say, oh my goodness, it's game over for us, right? We're done. We might as well, slink off and cower under our beds and wait for the eventual apocalypse. But it's a fascinating moment we live in, primarily because these challenges that I've been describing to you are bigger than our cognition. They're actually bigger than our brain's ability to comprehend easily. These numbers, once you get to a certain size, if I tell you that 1 million species are at risk of extinction, it's hard to imagine what 1 million species really is, especially across the entire web of life. So it's true we're living through the 6th extinction, through the 6th time in the entire history of life when biodiversity has collapsed. It's also true that we're living through the second renaissance, through an explosion of human capacity and capability, tools that are also hard for us to fully understand, to fully comprehend their power. And we're sort of torn between these two worlds. You know, if you are a pessimist, I can give you lots of reasons for your pessimism. If you're an optimist, I can give you lots of reasons for your optimism. And if you're confused, there's lots of reasons for confusion, because we're torn between the shearing forces of these two moments that we're living through. So let me talk about the stuff that's happening on the capabilities side of the equation for a moment. And in order to do that, I'd like to talk a little bit about the piece of the technology world that I work in, which is in remote sensing and the observation of the Earth. I entitled these remarks "The Moral Mirror," because I really believe we're living through this enormous sensor revolution in which we are beginning to be able to monitor all of the life on the Earth, all of the systems of the Earth, essentially in high resolution all the time. And in the process, beginning to understand our actions in a much broader and interconnected context, and understanding the interconnections of that context are the first step in understanding our moral imperatives to steward the possibility of the flourishing of life now and in future generations. Now, in the realm of technology, many of you will be very familiar with this. We live in this world of two, you know, if you think about a normal timeline, we live with two fundamental technology curves. And the first one will be visible to everybody and obvious to everybody, which is that we live in an era of accelerating capacity. You know, the first computers that took people to the moon were much less powerful than the ones on your wrist or on your phone. And now we have machines that are beating people at Jeopardy and chess and engaged in really advanced works in artificial intelligence and generating natural language and all of that. At the same time, there's a corollary curve, which is this one, which as that accelerating capacity per unit of technology power accelerates like this, things yoked to Moore's law, we also see the converse curve, which is the decelerating cost per unit of those technologies. And the first one, if the one at the top is the one that gives us all of that great, you know, AI and very powerful things, the one at the bottom is the curve that puts a device in everybody's hand. It's the curve that gives us a sense of capacity that's democratized. And across the middle, as a result of those forces, we live in a world in which our technologies undergo matter, energy, space, and time compression. They get lighter and smaller and faster and cheaper and efficient and more abundant. And in fact, actually, some of those are not good things. You know, Americans, I'm speaking from the United States today, we throw away 150 million cell phones a year. We don't recycle them, we throw them in the trash. So the abundance of that technology does have a profound ecological consequence. But the aggregate effect of the interplay of these two curves is to make things more efficient over time. And you can really see it, actually, if you just look at the energy intensity per unit of GDP for the whole world. As a result of these technologies, the cost of achieving wealth is diminishing in terms of its energy intensivity. We are de-intensifying the planet at about 1.6% a year. But these numbers, just for what it's worth, are nowhere near what they need to be in order for us to avoid the worst effects of climate change. We really have to dematerialize our economies. We have to figure out how to live much more lightly upon the earth than we do now if we want to avoid the worst kinds of consequences. So in order to do that, we're beginning to build the systems that allow us to take much more effective action. I'll just show you a quick animation here from our organization called Planet. We've deployed the largest constellation of Earth-observing satellites in history. Each one of these satellites, and we've launched now 400 and something of them, are about the size of a loaf of bread. And they orbit from the North Pole down over the equator, down over the South Pole, and they spin between the sun and the Earth so that each one is a camera, and collectively, as the Earth turns sideways underneath them, they collectively image the entire surface of the planet every day. Now, having that kind of power means that we've seen something like 12 or 1,300. We have 12 or 1,300 images of every place on the earth. That means everybody who's watching this, no matter where you are, where you went to bed tonight and where you got up and how you got to work and wherever you are when you're working, if you're not working from home these days, all of the world we've actually been able to see, not at the level where we're reading your newspaper, but where we're able to see the daily patterns of change. And what we do then is use the tools of artificial intelligence and machine learning to extract the underlying patterns associated with these. So what you're looking at here is an animation of an analytic that we've run where we've extracted all the roads and buildings out of every part of the planet on a given day. So this is all the roads and all the buildings everywhere. And that turns out to be a pretty good proxy for the human footprint. And if you can understand how it changes week to week and month to month, you can take much more effective action and understanding how to de-intensify our impacts. And in fact, the important thing to think about there is that the rate, velocity, and quality of information always gates the rate, velocity, and quality of action. So information and action are connected. If we speed up and improve the information, we can consequently speed up and improve the actions that we take. And because we're in this consequential decade, we've got to take a lot of actions. Let me show you a little bit about what that imagery actually looks like. What I'm going to show you here is an animation. You'll see it on the right-hand side of the screen. This is actually the emergence of deforestation deep in the Amazon. On the left-hand side, what you might notice is right after that deforestation occurs, this is, I think, deep in Brazil, you'll see these little spider webs appear. Those are the illegal roads that go in before the next round of deforestation occurs. If you can see the roads going in right before the deforestation occurs, then you actually can begin to interrupt that, but only if you use the tools of AI and machine learning and computer vision, only if you have a kind of cloud computing infrastructure, only if you have a kind of digital public goods that allow lots of people to analyze the data, to take the actions to interrupt the behavior that we want to interrupt, in this case, because we don't want to cut down the lungs of the planet that we're all required to breathe. Now, these kinds of digital public goods that I mentioned are starting to spring up all over the place. And I'll show you just a couple from our organization. David Jensen, who's with us, could tell us about a dozen others. He's running a bunch of these. But I'll give you just a couple. One is a thing called the Allen Coral Atlas. This is an effort that we and a group called Vulcan and a number of other academic institutions have undertaken to map all of the world's coral reefs in unprecedented detail and monitor them in real time for change. Then that asset is available. So for instance, there was a huge oil spill in Mauritius recently. And this data was enormously consequential right away in helping people understand the consequences of that spill in order to enable citizens to advocate for their rights with the responsible party and say these extraordinarily important coral reefs are part of our national heritage and you've got to both pay to clean them up and to compensate us. And they help us understand what the scientific impacts are. This project will be done by the end of the year, and all of this data is given away for scientific and conservation purposes. It's made available to everybody. This is another one we just completed in this here in the United States. You've probably heard we've had terrible wildfires here. This is something called the California Forest Observatory. I'm sorry, the link is wrong. It should be forestobservatory.com. And in it, we've used the satellite imagery and some very fancy techniques to map every tree in California, all of the biomass, so we know what's available to burn and where, and if a fire starts in any particular place, and you can actually see on this map a few of these gray areas that are ringed by orange, that's where the fires are actually burning today in California. And that gives the people who fight fires and who are working to reduce the effects of these climate exacerbated events, gives them a new tool for understanding in real time what's happening. And I'll mention just that last week, Planet just struck a deal with the United Nations to provide all of the data between 30 degrees north and 30 degrees south, covering all of the world's forests in the tropical belt, to the world on a quarterly basis for combating deforestation at scale. Now, I just want to leave you a couple of thoughts, and then we've had so many wonderful people to hear from. The first thing is that none of the technologies that I'm showing you are possible without the internet, just technologically. You can't run a global constellation that self-organizes and images the entire planet and without tons of cloud computing and storage and internet transport, and it's got to work globally, and it's got to work at the edge of the network, it's got to work across jurisdictions, and those are all things that fall under the kind of governance frame that people here are thinking about. The second thing is that if we're going to get genuinely inclusive models of planetary stewardship, we have to encourage this sort of digital public goods frame in which data assets even if they're generated from private goods, are transformed where possible into quasi-public goods, even if they're made public for not for corporations and the corporations pay the freight, the private sector interests pay the freight. We want to create this sort of archipelago of a kind of digital ecosystem for the environment. And the last point I'll just make is that, I've been working with the network for my entire adult life and worked on internet standards at the very beginning of my career. And the thing I can say is that I've really always seen the network as a political philosophy encoded as a technology. And as such, we're going to need that philosophy, which is federated, distributed. It's about empowering individuals and groups. And it's going to be absolutely essential to the ways in which we're going to take action with these tools. So I think of the network not just as a governance architecture, not just as a technical infrastructure, but as a culture of governance, as a culture of values that we're going to need. So anyway, that's a little bit just to start us off. Kahtryn, it's been great. By the way, if anybody's interested, I'll just share with you, that's my email address and my Twitter handle. I'd love to hear from you if you have questions we don't get to. And I'll turn the thing back. Turn the screen back to you, Kahtryn. Kahtryn, I don't think we can hear you.
Mute. Unmute.
Thank you. I was just thanking Andrew for that fantastic opportunity to understand the unique vantage point he has with Planet and their use of and where they see the future of environmental data, and also the very important role that internet governance will play with that. We also would love to hear from David today as well, and this ties in or segues in beautifully with what Andrew was just speaking about. David has been working with UNEP to spearhead the creation of the digital ecosystem for the planet, as well as embarking on a journey being undertaken by the broader UN framework to address environmental data as a digital public good. David, I would love it if you could help us understand a little more about what direction these initiatives are taking and where they're going and how they tie into this conversation on internet governance, if you wouldn't mind taking the floor.
Sure, thanks very much, Kahtryn, and thanks to all colleagues and Andrew for that stellar presentation. I'll try to keep it very short because I'm aware we're short on time, but it just really feeds off what Andrew was saying. There's this explosion of digital technology, explosion of data from the public sector, from the private sector. And the first question is, how do we bring that all together in a digital public good to be able to monitor the planet and monitor what's going on? But I think importantly, the real challenge is then, once we have that digital ecosystem in place and once we have the analytics in place, how do we begin to fundamentally change the incentive structure of the economy? And in particular, I think there are three areas we need to focus in on. The first is the financing structure. How do we begin to supply the data and the analytics into the way that financial decisions and investments are made fundamentally? And how can that financing actually be aligned towards our broader climate goals, our biodiversity goals, or our SDGs? So there's a whole pillar here on financing and really influencing financing to support sustainability. The second pillar, again, it's about supply chains and value chains. And how do we begin to do two things? One, monitor those supply chains much more systematically to look at their impact. And second, how do we put the incentives in place to achieve some of the goals that Andrew mentioned, dematerialization, decarbonization, detoxification? So how do we use the data and the various digital technologies to really advance sustainability at the supply chain level? And then the final one is about consumer behaviors. How do we, again, begin to drive consumption and consumer behaviors in a sustainable direction using digital technologies, like digital nudging, for example, or filtering, or all kinds of different applications where technologies help consumers take better decisions in terms of their consumption of sustainable products and services. So again, you start with the data ecosystem, and then you begin to use that data and those analytics to fundamentally change and influence the incentive structure of the financing side, the supply chain side, and the consumer behavior side. And I think that is sort of the big challenge we're dealing with. And as Andrew mentioned, the internet is the backbone for all of that. It's fundamentally important for all of it. It's the interconnection piece between those domains. And therefore, this conversation is especially germane. How do we govern the data side of it and the infrastructure so that it remains open and it facilitates the connections between those different domains? I'll stop there, and we can continue with the conversation. Thanks, Kahtryn. You're muted, Kahtryn.
I keep doing that so that I don't interrupt you. Really important initiatives that you're spearheading there, David, and so very complex in their execution. So we're really hoping that we could get Audrey to also weigh in on this with her perspective. Audrey, you've approached so many initiatives of similar complexity within the Taiwanese government where multiple stakeholder groups needed to engage. So we're just wondering, do you have any thoughts on how we could engage the broader spectrum of stakeholders to not only have the necessary conversations we need to about the role internet governance must play, but in also taking first steps towards tangible outcomes that can be adopted by all?
Yeah, thank you. And first of all, that was a stellar presentation and analysis, and I think we should work to unmute ourselves. That is to say, to make our voices heard, and also make sure that people who help the citizens get their voices heard when it comes to environmental sensing and so on are honored on the top of the presidential office, as is our annual presidential hackathon. So I just want to show you this very simple app. It's similar to many other mapping apps, but this one begin with like how many plastic bottles have people joined, have people saved, and here is where we are at the moment. And if I click one, it just shows which of the hot and warm water there, and people are just chatting about how the water tastes like. And this is just a digital nudging tool, a digital campaign that gets people, and the name is Tea Serving, which works with the Taiwan's culture from ages ago, where people would just beneath a large tree put basically some water for people to refill, and this is important to not only, like, it's a really healthy thing to do now that we're almost 40 Celsius degrees in the summer, and so that app can remind you to take water when it's needed, take more drinks, but also it socializes like Pokemon Go, the very act of taking your bottles and get to refill your bottles and make it a social signal so that more people do so instead of buying bottles. Because even in Taiwan, where more than 90% of glass and 95% of plastic bottles are recycled, because we're a country with many islands after all. We suffer the consequences more if we don't recycle. Still, it isn't the same if we don't get the citizens participating in the reduction at the very source at the beginning. And so every year we ask for data collaboratives proposals that are trisectoral in its composition. If it's not trisectoral to begin with, we help to find from the social and public and private sector until it's trisectoral. And every year, 5 of those teams receive a trophy from the president, Dr. Tsai Ing-wen, and a trophy is the shape of Taiwan with the Morse-coded SDGs to it, and a microprojector that basically, whenever you turn on the projector, it projects the president handing you the SDGs trophy, and therefore basically promising whatever you did in the previous 3 months. It could be this water refill mob, it could be the heat warning to get people into the habit of checking on the climate, it could be reducing reducing people's electricity use, by reminding them out of the smart meters, which of their home appliances are consuming more energy than needed. Maybe they need to change their behavior patterns. Of course, entirely voluntary. It's just a suggestion, or and so on. And so basically all of those SDG compliant massive data collaborative actions are handed the executive power as a hackathon award. So even though there is no money in that award, we're basically promising for the next 12 months, we'll do whatever we can to put those data collaboratives as national policy. And so it rewards innovation within the public sector that works in a horizontal fashion, and also rewards existing communities. For example, the primary school teachers, which is a very large community that teach data competence, because we don't teach data literacy anymore. We teach data competence, the ability to steward data by getting the students into the habit of maintaining a PM 2.5 air sensor, the air box, which is less than $100. And it's basically a global sustainable education tool. I mean, anybody can join it. It's essentially a distributed ledger. But as students learn about those environmental sensing ideas, they also become the advocates for new policies and new regulations. For example, they will then, even before they come to the age of voting, go to our e-petition platform and petition for the banning of the plastic straws for a national identity drink, the bubble tea. And that's an actual thing. And that actually happened with 5,000 signatures. And we finally negotiated a carbon neutral way to make organic straws, or even designed to be straw free, to dematerialize the straw. I like the term, and so on. And so the basic thing is just to make it fun, make those ideas worth spreading, have a high R value, viral marketing, and then bind them with the highest executive power to make sure that people who design those data collaboratives do not have to worry about the sustainability of their own project, but rather weave it into the K-12 curriculum education. And then it's very surprising how people who are like 15 years old, 16 years old are the best friends with people who are 60 years old and 70 years old. Both of those age groups, by our statistics, are the most active on our national participation platform on the presidential hackathon, because they both care more about the long-term future of humanity. And so this kind of intergenerational solidarity also very important. Those are the points I want to make at the beginning.
Amazing. Gosh, you have jam-packed so many incredible initiatives. I don't even know how you did it in that short period of time, but well done you. I think we need an award for that too. I particularly loved what you spoke about with respect to diffusing the executive function amongst stakeholders within the community and rewarding innovation, so people could see that the government was taking notice, not only notice, but taking action based on the winners of these different hackathons and what have you. How, and this is a question for everyone, Andrew, David, Audrey, I'd love you all to weigh in. How can we take those kinds of approaches and apply them to internet governance? I know that it's a very complex, there's lots of multi-layered, I guess, aspects to that, but anyone prepared to give it a stab?
Audrey, do you want to go? You want to give us a perspective?
Okay, sure. I'll be brief. I thought I just spoke at length, but okay. I think really there was a recent RFC, right? The internet is for end users, which means that we need to prioritize like people who use the internet more than the internal needs of the internet governance itself. We need to essentially engage the people in a way that's not just designing for end users, but with end users, or even after end users. And I think it's a broad declaration from the IAB, and that's of course a step forward. Then the internet is for everyone, which merely speaks about the cultural diversity and the global diversity of the internet, which is still a very important step. But I would argue that most of the work that I outlined, the civil IoT network, the presidential hackathon, and so on, really have the constituents as the generation of people that are very, very young, like before they even could log on to the internet, or who have not yet been born. or to use our indigenous nations ideas, the tip of Taiwan, almost 4,000 meters high, the Savia or Bendugunung, depending on which indigenous nations language you use, is a long-lived spirit, and they are the main stakeholder while human beings are merely steward to it. And whether you think about 7 generations down the line, or whether you think about the mountains and rivers as beings with thousands of years, these kind of constituents are in our democratic society less likely to be brought to the table unless there is a convincing anthropomorphication of it, which is essentially what the data fabric of data visualization and digital common good is doing. It's representing in our human time frame, in our tiny mammal brain, a avatar like in that movie, in what we can understand in the terms that we can understand the stakes of the future generations and so on. So all those sensing projects, I think, to me, is basically expanding our democratic governance to where constituents are not like an assembly made out of individual adults, but rather someone who could represent themselves ahead of their time, almost like a temporal pincer movement, if you have watched Tenet, this kind of thing. But I would like to also hear from Andrew to fill in the details. I was just talking very proper.
You know, where my mind goes, Audrey, is the convergence of 2 different ideas. So the first one is that there are experiments around the world now to give parts of the environment, the parts of our global ecosystem, but specific like niches, mountains, a certain forest, a river, legal standing. Right now, that one of the things that's fascinating is that, you know, one of the massive distortions of global capitalism is that the company Amazon is worth trillions of dollars. You know, it's going to be worth, God only knows. The actual Amazon is worth nothing unless you cut the trees down and sort of monetize the land and monetize the logs that you clear cut. So there are various movements around the world to assign legal standing, the same kind of standing that a corporation or a person would have in the legal system, to these important places. And they're often driven by indigenous communities for whom these places have not just ecological importance, but sacred importance. What I think about is another, so that's sort of on, let's put that on one side. On the other side, the thing that I find fascinating is that we're beginning to instrument some of these places. So for example, we're doing this project right now with a particular fire district in California. And we have working with this district that manages a forest which is at risk of burning. We've put all these sensors in the tree canopy. And the tree, it's a mesh network. So the sensors talk to each other constantly and are collecting information. At the first sign of a fire, the information is bridged between the nodes, ultimately reaches an access point and begins and signals to the satellites to start taking pictures so that we can get the most recent, real-time information about a forest fire. But instead of thinking about remote sensing, what's interesting is to think about other verbs like listening or presencing or communing. These are instruments of listening. They're also instruments that potentially convey both legal governance status, but also a kind of personhood, a kind of standing with us that takes the immense nature of the planet and begins to bring it down to scales that are resonant and meaningful for human affairs, and allows us to be in dialogue with them in new ways. And so to sort of think, to riff on Kahtryn's question, the internet architecture can absorb many different ideas of governance, many different ideas of what has standing and what's important and what's an institution. And it would be interesting to think about, in our international internet governance framework, non-nation state parts of the planet that have standing kind of within that ecosystem, within that technological governance ecosystem. Now, some of you might think it's been just very too late for me here, and that I'm going a little off the rails. But this is how the internet has always worked. Like that was I'm telling you, like that'll be an RFC. That'll be, someone will write that up, right? You know, that's how the internet progresses, is with these ideas that seem unobvious until they seem obvious.
Absolutely. And David,
yeah, I'm going to come at this a little bit more utilitarian. It's only 8:30 in the morning here, so I can be a little bit more straightforward. I look at the internet. You know, the internet succeeded because of the international standards that were adopted, right? The TCP/IP and all the standards below it basically underpin it. And in a way, that's what we need to learn from. How, you know, what was the process that derived those standards? How was it bottom up? How was it distributed? How was it multi-stakeholder? How can we replicate that in the digital age for environmental data? And how can we have some basic minimum standards so that environmental data can flow, can be interoperable, can be licensed, can be quality controlled, et cetera, et cetera. So what I would love to do is, you know, understand some of those basic processes that led to those international standards that underpin the internet and replicate those for this digital ecosystem for the planet. But obviously update them to the digital age and very much with this idea in mind of creating usable data and analytics for the globe that we can then use to drive, as I said, changes in the financial structure and supply chains and consumer behaviors.
Thank you so much.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to step on you, Kahtryn. I'd just say that point that David made, both in his remarks and just again there, we tend to think about the importance of environmental data for taking sort of conservation action, and like that's often a frame. Right, so we want to protect and preserve and conserve. And the thing that's interesting about many of those actions is they exist outside of the most dominant ism that we have, which is this sort of global capitalism, which is today, it's produced unrivaled prosperity around the world. It's also horribly incomplete because it treats as externalities that are not valued and not measured and therefore not valued. All of the value of all of that, what we might call natural capital, but others say things more simply like we need to measure the treasure of the abundance of the planet. And ultimately, we have no hope of a lasting alignment of humanity and the planet unless we are aligning capital markets and capitalism with the environment. And it's only going to be on platforms run on this next version of the internet that actually make it possible to produce the kinds of indicators that are scientifically fed by real-time information and science grade analytics that can feed conservation policy and governance, but can also be used to rate the climate risk of a country or a company or a supply chain, right? It's what David's talking about there, I think is, in some ways, it might be more important than the SDGs, the massive framework that we have for the long-term health of the planet, not just meeting a 10-year goal, a decadal goal, but meeting a centuries-long goal of the great transition. We have to reform capitalism. We can only do that, ironically, in a way that accommodates our thinking about the planet. We can only do that with the internet. There's literally no other mechanism for making the kinds of information flows that are required without these tools. So there's no question that there's a practical governance question there at the heart, as David said.
Let me just jump on that, though, just to say that I agree with everything you're saying. I think the other question is, how do we hard code some of these values or norms or targets into the algorithms that will underpin the digital economy? So how do we get this into the actual, the underlying architecture and the code of some of these platforms or e-commerce sites or whatever it is we're talking about, so it becomes, part and parcel of what we're talking about, and use this big moment of opportunity in terms of the digitalization of the economy to start inserting these opportunities everywhere. and how do we work with the communities that are actually, doing the coding and doing the standards to ensure they're thinking about these things systematically. So yeah, I think we're aligned. Sorry, Kahtryn, for interrupting.
No, and I would love to let you keep on going. Absolutely, such gold. I really appreciate the perspectives you're giving. They're absolutely on point with where we need to go with internet governance and environmental data. We do, however, need to say goodbye to Audrey. Want to appreciate your time and input, Audrey. Thank you so much for being a part of this today, and we want to thank you so very much. I know that you've got a really tight timeline, so we are going to have a few questions from the floor, but yeah, we wanted to say thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I just want to end with a provocation. Maybe by year 2030, internet protocols carry avian services. Bye.
Okay.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Can somebody interpret that for me? Do what? It was a technical joke which I didn't get.
I'm going to need to go back to the transcript. Look, Pablo, I know we don't have very much time. I was wondering, have we got time for 2 or 3 questions? We've still got Andrew and David here. It'd be a shame if we couldn't get a few questions from our audience.
So there have been an active conversation on the chat room, and if I can summarize the topics, they are about citizen science and the role of them. There is a lot on e-waste. There is also a lot of the differences between developing and developed countries on the environmental aspects of things. We can also try to have a couple of interventions if someone wants to raise the hand. I haven't seen any hand yet, but we can do that. And something that also I would like before we finish is to give some hints and your advice for the synthesis document. What's next?
Yeah, fantastic. Well, we've got a question that's come through from Binod. I was wondering whether Binod would mind taking the mic to ask that question of whomever he'd like to respond.
Well, am I heard?
Yes. Hi.
Yes. Hi, hello everyone. Well, my question is actually for everyone, actually, but especially for Andrew, I guess. So when we talk about environmental protection and conservation, it always seems like we are one step forward, but then we're taking 2 steps back. So the net effort is always at vain. So till today, till what has been done, what has been observed so far that, that the technology has contributed to protection of environment, and we in IGF community, what our endeavors must be here on, and what are the biggest challenges till now that we've not been able to achieve those goals? That is my question. Thank you.
Really appreciate the question and the spirit behind it. I guess the first thing I would say to you is that, well, let me start with, there are many outcomes. There are outcomes every day from the use of these tools. We've never had better tools to bring to bear on these questions than we have now. We don't have all of them that we need. We can't solve every problem, but we can certainly guide action with more precision and more efficiency, and therefore more impact if we're thoughtful about it than we ever could before. And I'll just say a couple of things there. I showed something called the Allen Coral Atlas, and just earlier this year, just before the COVID shutdown, there were a new series of national parks in eastern Sri Lanka that were voted into law, and they were substantially voted into law because the people who were advocating for that change in the status of those reefs were able to use this tool to show the intrinsic biodiversity of the area and why it was important to protect it. And it was enormously influential in actually getting those kinds of places protected. there are countless examples like that one, and I won't bore you with too many of them. But let me just to say at the beginning, there are plenty of steps forward. Are there also steps backward? Yes, of course there are. And I think that the issues that we've been talking about around how we embed these kinds of tools in the global capital flow of goods is going to be absolutely essential, because we like to say at Planet, you can't fix what you can't see. And much of the problem is invisible to our everyday senses. So a big part of these tools is to make the invisible visible. And so in so doing, to enable more effective action. I think if you can make the invisible visible and then you can build rules around it, you can make it the default. And in so making it the default, we can substantially lighten the impacts. There's needless waste. There's waste is always by definition waste, but there's waste that's especially wasteful that we could get rid of and no one would feel a bit of pain over it. We just don't know about it most of the time. David, do you have a point of view?
Well, I mean, these conversations are extremely important in bringing these communities together. From the environmental community, we have not systematically engaged in digital governance, and I think vice versa. So this conversation is essential. I think the other thing that tends to happen is we get distracted on the wrong problem. And I'll give you an example, or maybe it's not the wrong problem, but it's not a full frame of the problem. And if you look at a company like Amazon, for example, that are trying to take some really big steps on climate action and climate mitigation in their supply chain, they're trying to figure out how do they deliver their products and services to the world with less carbon in the transport, and that's really important. That's a really important goal, and I applaud them for doing that. But at the same time, they should also be looking at the actual sustainability of those supply chains themselves and the products and services they're selling. And they should be giving consumers much more information about the environment and carbon footprint of everything on Amazon. And they should be helping people take better decisions. If people want to buy low carbon footprint products and services, they need to help enable that, either through filters or for nudging or whatever else. So the way that this problem is being solved by Amazon is only focusing on the transport side of it is not enough. It's important, but not enough. We need much more action also on the actual supply chains of every product and service inside the platform.
Yeah, can I just pick up on that one thought by excellent point by David. We're working with one of the world's largest consumer goods companies right now. I can't say very much about this, but I'll give you just the general outline, where one of the things they want to be able to ensure is that their products are deforestation free. So we can encode at the sensor in space when we look down precisely the moment when trees are harvested and what techniques are used to harvest them. We can put that imagery in a kind of like blockchain-like distributed ledger that's highly encrypted and goes all the way from the point of origin through to the person who is using the product, all the way through to this sort of like the post-consumer side of the person only has that product for a few weeks and then it disappears again from their lives. You want to handle the whole life cycle of that. These kinds of technologies, the combination of satellite technologies and ground technologies and distributed blockchain technologies and on and on and on and on, all of them, they're all going to play a part in bringing David's vision to life.
Absolutely.
Now we have to stop.
Yeah.
Pablo's given us this. Pablo's like, stop.
Really
stink eye
from Pablo. We do want to give you both time to give us a very fast one sentence outcome or last words before we say a massive thank you. You've got about 30 seconds each. David, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I mean, my big priority right now is an international framework for data governance, and we're working to start a collective intelligence process to understand what that framework would look like. I think Pablo has a link he's going to put in the chat. So we're collecting views on how would we establish an international environmental data governance framework, what could it contain, and how could it really add value to the stakeholders, around the world. So I would really encourage colleagues to engage in that survey and to reach out to me if they're interested in this topic and want to engage further. Thank you very much.
Awesome, fantastic.
Great. I'll just add, I have no idea what avian protocols are, but they sound important. But more importantly, I think there's not much I could improve upon what David said. This is a time of real action, and everybody in the internet governance community has an important role to play. If you can effectively open the aperture for this dialogue to occur, I think there's all kinds of positive innovation.
That we're also so grateful that you took the time out today at this ungodly hour for you, Andrew, and for yourself too, David. Thank you so much. We're going to need to wrap up. Any last words, Pablo?
Thank you all, and until next time. Momos in Kathmandu, I hope. Ciao.
Go well, and thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. It was a real pleasure.
Thank you, everyone. It was a lot of fun.
I just want to thank you enormously for this. There